Welcome to the September 9th, 2024 City Council work session, and we're all glad to be back in this space after a summer break. So thank you all for joining us in this hybrid meeting format. For work sessions like this one, where there is no opportunity for public comment, those wishing to access the meeting can do so by watching the live stream available on our website, the broadcast on Comcast Channel 21, or by calling into one of the phone numbers listed for this meeting on the public webcast and meeting materials web page. So I'm making this announcement for the meeting as a whole. In case of a medical emergency, an automated external defibrillator, AED, is located on the counter behind the staff, located to your left on the west side of the room, over there. And so we urge you to take a moment to familiarize yourself with the room and your surroundings. In case of an emergency evacuation, there are emergency exits to your right on the east side of the room that lead to the patio, and an emergency exit through the double doors located at the back of the room. So the double doors there and those doors there. Got it. Okay. All right. Thank you for those instructions. Yeah. And so with that, I call the September 9th, 2024 City Council work session to order. And our first item of business is a discussion of a interim police auditor. And I'm going to turn it directly over to Mia Carriaga to just sort of give us the framework for this.
Thank you, Mayor. Mia Carriaga, Central Services Director. And you'll recall that at a meeting shortly before your break started, I was here to talk briefly about the process that we might use to appoint an interim police auditor. And I was able to meet with Council President Keating and Council Vice President Groves over the break to put a framework in front of you today. And I'm going to turn it over to Councilor Keating to share a little bit about those conversations.
Thank you, Mia. It's been a pleasure to work with you throughout this process, and I thank Leah Pitcher for her service and professionalism in this role. We have had conversations with Mark Gissner, the former police auditor. These are not negotiation conversations, more gauging Mark's interest. And I will say there is an interest. And what we look forward to tonight, and I'm happy to put a motion on the table, and I'm happy to wait until after you share a little bit more with colleagues. But what I'm looking forward to tonight is your direction to authorize myself and Council Vice President Groves to move forward with a negotiation to hire on an interim police auditor. In particular, we're going to have follow-up conversations with former police auditor Mark Gissner.
Okay, thank you. So I'll just add a couple of things. And as you know, Leah Pitcher is leaving the organization as of this Friday at 5 o'clock. And unlike potentially other city positions, by charter, you do need to appoint an interim police auditor. And so we are looking today for direction to work with the council leadership to appoint someone by 5:01 p.m. this Friday so that that seat is not vacant.
Thank you. So I know Councilor Keating does have a motion to put on the table, but I would, and we could just go ahead and do that, unless someone has a burning question before that. Okay, why don't you go do that?
Thanks, Mayor. Move to appoint Mark Gissner as the interim police auditor and authorize the council and vice president to negotiate and execute an interim police auditor employment agreement with compensation, including a base salary, living allowance, and incidentals, not exceeding the maximum annual amount currently budgeted for the position of police auditor.
Second.
Okay, any discussion or questions about that motion? Councilor Groves.
Thank you, Mayor. Just quickly, Mia, could you just give us a little bit of comparison with similar situations we've done in the past? For example, we had an outside interim police chief for a while. Is what we are looking at here, is that consistent with what we've done in the past?
Sure. You might recall that several years ago we did have an outside interim police chief. We also recently had an outside interim fire chief. And in those instances, we negotiated employment agreements with them. And we'd probably use something similar in this process.
Thank you.
Any other questions, comments? Alan.
I worked very closely with Mark when he was council president, and when he was here, we made amazing strides in putting together this program and making it stable. And actually, in the end, he was probably, if not the best, among the best police auditors in the country. So it'd be great if he could come back and play that interim role and come out of retirement for us. So that would be awesome. The fact that not to exceed the maximum amount of our budget means there's no budget impact other than who gets paid. So I think that's all great, and I encourage Mark to say yes.
Great, thank you. Yeah, Mike.
Thank you, Mayor. Did you have any preliminary discussions with Mark about any role he might play in the selection process for a permanent auditor?
Thank you. In the one conversation on the phone I had with Mark last week, he indicated that there is a conference coming up in Tempe, Arizona in October that would be a perfect place for HR and the city staff to look for a prospective full-time auditor. So we might be able to save some consultant dollars, knowing full well where prospective auditors are gathering, or folks who are doing this work across the country. So that was the one element in which we scratched the surface for a permanent replacement.
Did you negotiate any sort of what it would take monetarily for him to assist in counsel or advice with the candidates or process?
I haven't engaged in any negotiations yet because I'm waiting for your direction.
I would like to offer a friendly to your motion that also empowers the council officers to discuss counseling services with him that he may or may not look at separately to assist us in the acquisition of a permanent auditor. May I offer that friendly?
I'm not sure what you mean, actually. Could you clarify what you're talking about?
Sorry.
I don't think I understand the motion.
I'm offering to add to the motion that the council officers are not only empowered to negotiate with him for his services to be the police auditor, but if any additional monies he might ask for to negotiate or the process of counseling us on the acquisition and hiring of a new full-time permanent auditor.
I would submit, Counselor, that's part of the role. And at least in the preliminary conversations I've had, that seems to be
that's why I asked
that
the
seems to be
question.
wholly understood. So I hear you. I don't think it's necessarily needed as an amendment. So I'm not going to accept it as a friendly, but I think it's wholly understood as part of the role.
Knowing Mark, I just wondered if you thought that might be extra cost.
Mia?
Yes, if I may, I'll just remind everyone that my team will be back on September 23rd to discuss recruitment of a new auditor, permanent auditor, and we can certainly bring back options that reflect what you just talked about at that
Thank you
time.
very much.
Alan, anyone want a first round before I give Alan a second? Okay, go for it. Oh, you're still on mute.
I was going to say that I think that's probably part of his job duties as the interim auditor to kibitz with us on how to do that. And I think having the city represented at the conference might be a really good idea to send Mark there. He knows all those people for years and can represent it. And so, that could be part of his duties as well, going to that conference. And I wouldn't skimp on having hiring a consultant to help us. That's a small part of the budget compared to the overall cost of what it takes to get an auditor, and even smaller if you have to go out again, if you blow it. So getting some help from some professional recruiting is a good idea for a position like this. Very highly specialized.
Okay, thank you. Any other comments or questions? All right, there's a motion on the table. It's been seconded. All in favor, please raise your hands. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and that passes. Thank you very much. Thank you, Counselor Keating, for your leadership. Oh, I'm sorry, Counselor Leach is on, thank you. I'm sorry, Lindsay, I left you out. You raised your hand.
I voted yes. Thank you.
So much. I'm sorry, I skipped over you, so that's 7-0. Thank you. Okay, so now we're ready for the next item, work session on the financial condition. I'll turn it over to the manager.
Thank you, Mayor. I'll just offer a few words while they get set up here, because Twyla's actually going to walk us through just a refresher of where we are financially. I know between July, after we pass a budget and do supplemental and go on breaks, it's sometimes hard to remember all the different things that are built into the year, but our fall is pretty busy, and based on previous direction to come back with some discussions about the fire fee and long-range planning. We have a pretty full fall, so this is really just intended to be a high-level intro for you to ask questions and for us to clarify where we think we're going, and then we'll have time to discuss that afterwards. So with that, I'll turn it over to our CFO, Twyla Miller.
Good evening. Thank you so much. Thank you, Sarah, and thank you, Mayor and City Councilors. It's good to be with you tonight. So I have a series of slides, some you've seen before, but some are new. So over the past year, we've had many conversations about our financial condition and potential revenue solutions as we've discussed the issues shown here on this slide. The critical funding gap in the general fund, which we are beginning to address this year, and then also areas at risk, which are services funded with one-time dollars that are approaching the end of funding as we look to the future. This includes one-time funding included in the adopted budget for items such as Human Services Commission funding, or HSC, the Green Hill contract, and also services such as unhoused services, operating property tax levies for the library and parks that will expire in future years, as well as our community safety payroll tax. The third area is new and/or expanded services, and these include services such as affordable housing and climate and sustainability efforts. These have been funded with limited duration funding and/or some ongoing funding, but the service needs desired by our community are greater than the funding that we currently have allocated on an ongoing basis. Additionally, as our community continues to grow, additional service needs will be needed, such as new fire station and other services to service a growing community. And as we've had these discussions over the past years, we've considered a range of tools, including new revenues and other budget strategies, to help develop solutions as we look to the future. So when we think about our critical funding gap, this is in our general fund, and this is a structural gap where our expenditures are growing at a faster rate than our expenditures. Our expenditures are growing at a faster pace than our revenues. Our 23-25 adopted budget, you will remember, contained about $25 million in budget strategies over the biennium. And in addition, we repurposed about $5 million to make investments in downtown, unhoused, and alternative response programs. Even with these efforts, at that time, an additional gap remained. It was $8.3 million. And our adopted budget contained a revenue placeholder, as we knew we needed to do additional work to consider revenues or additional budget strategies as we came into the biennium. And our biennium began in July of 2023. As we discussed this spring, the gap has since increased to $13.9 million. And this is really related to expenditure pressures as we think about the service system. In the near term, our first-year gap remains at $8.3 million, and in FY26, which is the first year of our next biennium, there's an additional ongoing gap of $5.6 million. So as a reminder, property taxes, EWEB silt, and service charges are our top three revenue sources in the general fund. These three revenue types account for approximately 85% of all general fund revenues, with property taxes representing the largest share at 71%. This slide shows the actual growth rate over this 5-year period, and it's 2.6%. We look at expenditures over the same time period. The average annual growth rate over these 5 years was just 3%, which reflects a lot of efforts to cut costs and increase efficiencies over this time period. And even with a high degree of fiscal stewardship, the growth in expenses exceeded the average revenue growth of just 2.6% over this time period. The average annual expense growth rate of 3% excludes expenditures of one-time funding such as America Rescue Plan dollars or ARPA, state homelessness response funds, and opioid settlement funds. In order to provide an apples-to-apples comparison of revenues and expenditures, these one-time dollars were allocated to high-priority needs that didn't have other funding sources. So if we include expenditures from these one-time funds, the average annual expense growth rate over these 5 years was 5.1%. As we think about drivers that impact expenditures, inflation and personnel costs have a major impact on our financial picture. So we are continuing to watch inflation over time. The Oregon Office of Economic Analysis issues inflation forecasts 4 times each year. This chart shows the most recent forecast from September 2024, as shown by the blue line on the right-hand side. Actual inflation peaked at 7.2% in FY22, 6.3% in FY23, and is at 3.3% in FY24. And it's projected to move more towards the 2% target range as we look to the out years of our forecast period. While inflation appears to be tempering and all indications indicate that the Federal Reserve will lower the federal funds rate later this month, the forecast would be significantly impacted if inflation remained higher above that 2% range we have in our forecast. An increase of just 1% annually over the rates we have in our forecast adds about a $20 million expense load to our expenditures over that time period. Another cost driver on our expenditure side are the costs related to PERS, the Public Employees Retirement System. The Oregon legislature creates the pension plan. The Oregon Investment Council invests the assets, and the PERS board sets the rates that employers must pay to fully fund the system. The city does not determine the benefits or cost of PERS, and due to previous lawsuits and court rulings, the ability to affect system costs have been limited. I do like to show this graphic as I think it is a good reminder of the components of the system. PERS rates for employers are driven by the projected liabilities of retirees, inactive members, and current PERS members. The legislature has made changes over the years to amend benefit programs to more sustainable levels, although 71% of the cost is due to members who are either already retired or who are inactive, no longer actively working for a PERS employer. This is shown on the chart on the left. These retirees have earned benefits, and the courts have said that these benefits cannot be reduced retroactively. City employees hired after 2003 fall within the OPSERT program, whose members comprise just 10% of PERS actuarial liabilities. The chart on the right shows the PERS funding comes mostly from investment earnings, while just about 25% of employee and employer contributions make up the rest of the system's funding. So PERS employer contribution rates are updated every other year, and these updates have caused steep rate increases for the city. This table shows the past 4 updates, and the far right-hand column shows the advisory rates from the PERS actuary for the coming biennium. Our advisory rate estimate includes the estimated impact of House Bill 4045, the provision that lowers the normal retirement age for police officers and firefighters in OPSERP. The black numbers on the table show the employer contribution rates as a percentage of payroll, while the red numbers reflect the increase from the prior rate. These red figures reflect the cost increases for the city every time the PERS rates increase. We do expect to receive our actual PERS rates for the next biennium this coming October. This table shows the general fund PERS costs for each fiscal year. In FY26, the PERS costs in the general fund are forecast to increase by $5.3 million, or an increase of 23% over FY25. This significant cost increase is almost equal to the increase in property tax revenue anticipated in that same year. This is a good example of an expense that grows faster than revenues. It's very difficult to absorb other cost increases when a single line item like PERS essentially consumes the increase of our largest property tax revenue, or property tax source in our general fund. And while inflation and PERS rates certainly can have a large impact on our financial condition, there are a range of drivers that we'll be watching as we update forecasts this fall and winter. This fall, in October, as we do it every year, we'll receive our property tax information from the tax assessor. And as I mentioned before, we'll also receive our PERS rates for our actual rates for the next biennium. And we are also negotiating multiple labor contracts over the next 18 months. It's important to note that any of the factors shown here on this slide can have the potential to significantly impact our forecast and the budget gap as we look to the future. We will continue to manage over the midterm as longer-term solutions, including potential property tax reform and economic development, are explored. So we've shown this chart before, but this really shows the budget strategies that we've implemented since fiscal year 10. These strategies represent a mix of service reductions, realignments, where we've moved services from the general funds to non-general funds where appropriate, and miscellaneous revenue increases, such as increasing fees and charges for service. The budget strategies resulting from the Great Recession started in earnest in fiscal year 10 and have occurred in almost every year thereafter. While many of these strategies are ongoing in nature, some were one-time or limited duration. These strategies were necessary to align our expenses with available revenues and to manage our reserves so that we had an adequate savings account for unexpected events in the future. Given the limited growth of our current general fund revenues, additional budget strategies will continue to be necessary in the current environment, not only to live within our means, but also to rebuild our reserves as we come out of the pandemic. So this chart here is showing our general fund adopted operating budget per capita over the past 18 years between fiscal year 08 and fiscal year 25. It's important to note that we've adjusted the numbers for inflation, and they're shown in today's dollars. You can see that the trend is relatively flat over time, and we are spending less per resident today than we were back in fiscal year 08, which means expenditure growth is not keeping pace with inflation and population growth in our area. And here's another look at our general fund FTE. This shows FTE per 1,000 population, which is a common metric for government entities. You can see that the FTE per 1,000 has continuously declined as budget strategies have been implemented over this time period. We now have fewer general fund employees providing services to a growing city population, and the current FTE per 1,000 population is about 20% below pre-recession levels. Last spring, we presented you a two-year approach to our critical funding gap in the general fund. This past June, you took action on the supplemental budget to implement a range of budget strategies. Some were one-time and ongoing. These were a range of smaller revenues, which are those things we can implement administratively, and other budget strategies that are being implemented this fiscal year, which started this past July. Additionally, you had adopted an ordinance expanding the definition of stormwater services to add operations and maintenance of city-owned parks and open spaces. Expanding stormwater service fee eligibility to all park services will generate approximately $1 million in stormwater fee revenue to fund parks and open space expenses currently funded by the general fund. The administrative process to enact this fee is happening this fall. The ongoing strategies related to June actions will provide $3.5 million in ongoing strategies towards the total $13.9 million gap. The executive team is working on an additional set of budget strategies to address the gap not covered by the proposed fire fee. The remaining gap is currently estimated at $2.4 million, and the strategies may include a mix of smaller revenues, service alignments, and other budget changes, including the possibility of some one-time revenues from property sales. The remaining $8 million of the structural gap is proposed to be addressed through a new fire fee that you will begin to consider later this month. The fire fee can also be structured to include an additional $2 million towards enhanced services for fire to provide additional resources for our community. However, because the $8 million fire fee stabilization revenue addresses the structural gap in the current service system, if we do not implement the fire fee, we will need to implement a $10.4 million package of budget strategies beginning in July of 2025 as we implement our new proposed budget for the new biennium. And this will address the structural gap that's remaining after these other budget strategies have been implemented. As service delivery is also already very lean, reductions of this magnitude would result in very hard choices, as outwardly facing programs would likely need to be reduced or eliminated. So the solution set I just reviewed really is addressing the critical funding gap issue. But as I mentioned earlier, there are many other important services and programs that are in the other areas at risk, and new and or expanded services that we will also need to address as we look to the future. Which brings us to long-range financial planning. So the elements shown here are the foundation of long-range financial planning. Long-range financial planning focuses the organization on long-term objectives, encourages strategic thinking, and helps link our financial considerations to operational decisions and our strategic plan. It also enables the organization to take a proactive approach rather than being in a reactive state. While these elements have been incorporated in our practices for many years, we are taking a different, more comprehensive approach this budget cycle as we build our 2025-2027 budget. The finance team is currently working with department leadership across the organization to understand the critical issues facing programs as we look out over the next 4 to 5 years. This effort, along with forecasting and assessment activities, will help develop a range of potential levers to address upcoming issues, including program areas identified in the areas at risk and the new and/or expanded services. These may include short-term and long-term solutions as we look to the future. We plan on having a long-range financial planning work session with you in January to provide an update on this important work. So we are currently in the second year of our first biennial budget. As we come into the fall, the 2025-2027 budget development process is beginning with the development of the Capital Improvement Program, or the CIP, forecast modeling, and rate development. We are continuing the development of strategic budgeting by looking at our services through a program lens and how those programs and services tie to our strategic plan and our desired outcomes. Long-range financial planning will help us focus our efforts on the upcoming 2-year cycle while also identifying additional needs in future biennia to help inform strategic decision-making as we look to the future. Currently, we also have 2 service area reviews or organizational assessments that will be reviewed over the next 5 months. One is Library, Recreation, and Cultural Services, or LARCS, and the other is Core Business Functions. This includes functions such as finance, human resources, risk, information technology, and other core business services. These reviews will engage an external consultant to evaluate our current organizational structure, our service level and staffing, conduct service efficiency studies to provide actionable recommendations, explore revenue opportunities for LARCS, and also propose recommended future state models. All of these components together will help us develop the 25-27 budget as we come into the coming year. So what is coming next? We have a very full fall and winter ahead of us. So first, you can see that we're coming back on September 30th to begin a discussion on a potential fire fee. As you can see, this is a very ambitious timeline, but it's very important as we need to determine the viability of a fire fee as we prepare the 25-27 biennial budget that begins this next July 1st, 2025. These discussions and this timeline helps us understand if a fire fee is part of the solution set or if we need to switch gears and more fully develop a second set of budget strategies that total $10.4 million to to address our structural gap in the general fund. If the fire fee is advanced, it will become part of the 25-27 adopted budget conversation and will be implemented in July. We'll also have a supplemental budget this December. This will be a slightly different supplemental budget than you're used to having, as we're in mid-cycle through a biennium. We are doing our annual audit and preparing our annual financial comprehensive financial report, or ACFR, which will come to you also in December, but we will not recognize audit decisions or audit results on this budget, including marginal beginning working capital. So I expect this supplemental budget to be more administrative in nature, recognizing new revenues such as grant revenues and other administrative items as we come into our second year of the biennium. We will include the Budget Committee in this process. If it is more administrative, it will likely be through a memo and outreach with our executive team to their budget buddies. If there are more substantive changes on this supplemental budget, we will have a Budget Committee meeting prior to the December 9th council meeting. We'll also be meeting with you to discuss long-range financial planning efforts. You've asked for a work session focused on exploring additional funding for climate action and sustainability work before you go on your winter break. And we will also have a companion work session coming back in January to discuss our long-range financial planning work that we're undertaking this fall. As this is a CIP year, the Budget Committee will review the CIP at a February Budget Committee meeting, and Council will adopt the CIP in March. The first 2 years of our capital improvement program do become the basis of our capital budget for the next biennium. And then between now and March, we will be refining our next biennial budget proposal, considering all of the things I've talked about this evening. The city manager will present her budget in April, and we'll have a series of Budget Committee meetings in May as they deliberate the budget before Council takes action in June to ensure we have legal appropriations for July. That's all the information we have for you this evening. I'll see if the city manager has anything to add. Okay.
Thank you. It's daunting, so I appreciate the reminder of how daunting it is, and then the review. Are there questions or comments from councilors? Randy?
Thank you, Mayor, and thank you, Twyla, for the presentation. Whatever I just said. Thank you, Mayor. Thank you, Twyla. That was very informative. I always appreciate what you bring to the table in having these difficult discussions. Question, is the additional $5.6 million in FY26, I'm assuming that's roughly 2.4% of budget, because I saw the inflation rate's about 2.4%. Are there other things in that amount of money?
Oh, that are causing the gap?
Causing the gap, yes, thank you.
Yes, so it really is expenditure pressure. So when we look over the service system, it is inflation, it is higher, anticipating higher PERS rates and personnel costs and other expenditure pressures. There are some lower revenues, but it really is driven on the expenditure side by those primarily inflation and related personnel rates.
Thank you. Sometimes I see the number and then I see a reference to a percentage, and I just always like to connect those two together. And I think for the public that's listening, that's important as well. The next question I have is really more of an IGR question, and we just had an IGR meeting this last week. But I'm really interested, since we're not the only city experiencing this. It's cities across the state, and the structural problem with our property tax limitations. Is there any discussion at the state level that you are aware of for property tax reform? And that can be the manager that answers that as well.
Yeah, sure. Yes, so the League of Oregon Cities actually have tackled this statewide and have hired several consultants, including Eco Northwest and another engagement group that is not from Oregon. I think they're out of California, to really understand what is happening across the state. They've been hosting focus groups across the state with community members, trying to understand what they understand about the property tax system and seeing where there might be some interest in or possibility for change. I think they're about to do a statewide survey based on what they learned in those focus groups, and then all of that could come forward as a strategy as part of the legislature. It's a lot of moving things in place, but there is a lot of discussion about this.
As these discussions progress, I think it's going to be incredibly important that we have a good communication plan to the public and that we help make sure people understand why this is happening and the position we're in. In my rounds out in the community, I don't think people see this. They see it more as we're just not controlling our spending. And there's really more to the story than just that. So anyway, thank you. I still am concerned about the fire fee, but I will look forward to hearing more about that in the coming weeks. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Matt, and then Alan.
Thanks, Mayor. Thank you, Twyla. I share Councilor Grove's concern about the fire fee, so I look forward to learning more. I appreciate Twyla inserting the word proposed in your presentation. Page 7 in particular doesn't denote that the fire fee stabilization or the enhanced fire service are proposed, but I appreciate you honing in on that. The 5.5% non-departmental general fund expense jumps out. Is there a place on our website, and I'll preface this question with this comment. I so miss the days where we worked with a vendor that had the ability for every resident at eugene-or.gov to pull the budget levers and build their own budget. It was an interactive budget. I could use that as a city councilor, and I suspect that there would be interest, but I also understand that takes money. My question is there a place on our website, looking at that 5.5% increase in non-departmental programs, that indicates what said non-departmental programs are and their annual cost and or their impact to our community?
Yes, so the non-departmental expenses are primarily made up of transfers out from the general fund to other funds. And the higher growth rate during this time frame is really attributed to the additional support from the general fund to non-general funds as we came through the pandemic. So that's higher than you might have seen in the past, but that non-departmental in this slide you saw was primarily transfers out to other funds. We do have our digital budget book on our website, so there's a lot of great information, and you can take a look at different levels, and there's lots of information there. So if the public is interested in looking at more detail, it's a great tool, and it's on our budget website.
Thank you, Twyla. I might do a round 2 based on what other questions come up, but I look forward to a deeper dive into the proposed fire service fee. I have heartburn, I have reservations, I've expressed those privately, and I'm happy to share those with you at the appropriate time.
Okay, thank you. Alan.
Thanks for the update. I think context is very important as we move forward. And slides 11, 12, and 13, the budget strategies per capita graphs are really important. In slide 11, it says that 13 of the last 16 budgets have been cut budgets. Slide 12 and 13 talk about we have the lowest cost per capita in the last 18 years for government, lowest number of employees per capita in the last 18 years, and still providing excellent service to the citizens. And I think what that shows is that we have been really good stewards of the tax dollars of the citizens of Eugene and trust us to provide those services. I think that kind of context of where we've been and where we are today compared to where we were is really important as we move forward. I do realize that the outlook is kind of bleak at nearly a $14 million gap budget deficit. But I like where we're heading, and I'm eager to hear more details.
Okay, thank you. Other questions, need for clarification, comments? Well, we've heard bits of this and this whole thing a number of times, so I guess it's starting to sink in with enough repetition. If there are no other questions or comments, then we are finished with this item, and we are adjourned.